Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande.
He'll go to his bedroll to grab his keyboard printer fake computer. It looks like a Dath Ilani cording keyboard, connected by silver wire to a number of animated printing press types that dart out and impress themselves on the paper as he chords. He types up a draft slowly, and then at the end, reads and retypes it much faster. Why I Think Keltham Should Not Destroy Pharasma's Creation, by Carissa Sevar. People live here. This argument is uncomplicated and correct, and should be decisive if understood, but I will continue writing anyways. If there's a trillion identical copies of you, and 999,999,999,999 die and one survive, that's not like all of you, ending up as the one surviving version. It's like 999,999,999,999 people dying, and is exactly 99.999999999% as bad as 1 trillion people dying. This Keltham may have been that one lucky survivor, when he died inside the 0.00000000001% of Dath Ilans that were visible to or connected to a place like Pharasma's Creation, and where somebody bothered to copy that Keltham into the world wound. And to him it feels like nothing happened, but that's not what happens every time to everyone. 99.999999999% of the Kelthams died, and didn't think any more thoughts and didn't exist at all. And that's horrifying. Existing is the greatest gift we have. It's the premise of all other gifts, obviously, but that's not what makes it great. Though I respect that a tortured soul in hell may want to stop existing, I think they're making a mistake, maybe the hugest mistake there is, if that actually got them destroyed. So long as they're alive at all, and thinking and feeling even if what they feel is pain, they have something that's better than the absence of all that. Happiness is better than suffering, but not to the same degree that both are better than null, nothingness, non-existence. People can say words like that but not really feel what it would mean, because how can you imagine that? Anything you imagine it feeling like is not what it is, which is nothing. Trying to feel that head-on is like trying to look into the sun, a horror blinding enough that your mind wrenches away without actually thinking about it. The fact that nobody ever thinks about this, or can ever think about it, causes everybody to systematically underestimate how bad it actually is, and not be able to correctly estimate that being a paving stone is hell is still better than that. Pain is something you can accept. Suffering is something you can accept, so long as there's still an awareness there to accept it. Non-existence can't be accepted because there's nobody there to come to terms with how awful it is. Pharasma gave that gift to everyone in this world, and even the people in hell were not wronged by it. The people in this world do not want to be destroyed. While some people got worse deals at birth, like those in Cheliax who mostly went to hell, a lot of people got prospective local chances at afterlives that look a lot like the overall statistics for Golarion. Those people overwhelmingly did not, and do not, express horror and regret at having been born into a place like Golarion, where that was their lot. They don't try to save up for a malediction to Abaddon, or even really complain all that much. It would be a straw version of my argument to say that this shows, directly, that Pharasma's Creation is a good deal for the people born into it on average, or that you shouldn't destroy the entire thing. People could, for example, be mistaken about their personal probability of going to hell, or be mistaken about how bad hell was if they went there. As I do admit, I was now mistaken to some degree. But the fact that people don't seem to think it's a near thing, or that you should seriously debate in depth whether to destroy Pharasma's Creation, that Rovagug cultists are universally and unhesitatingly regarded as the villains by everybody who isn't one of the tiny fraction of Rovagug cultists, illustrates that this is not the sort of near thing where people being off by a factor of 3 about their personal probability of going to hell is going to change that. Yes, some people here got the shitty end of the deal, and now said, in your vision of hell, please kill me, as probably did mean, in context, that they wanted to stop existing. Even those people didn't ask you to destroy Axis too, or scream that you ought to destroy Axis as the price of destroying hell. They were distracted, and probably didn't know you were listening, but they did not, in fact, scream that. They didn't scream, please destroy everything. Maybe they would have, if you'd asked. Realistically, they wouldn't have been screaming anything that complicated, with nobody apparently listening at all. But you can't actually say that even the people in hell asked you to do this. Maybe the people in hell would tell you to destroy everything, but the people not in hell would not tell you that. The people alive in this world right now, who might go to hell with around the same probability as anybody from Galarian ends up in hell, would overwhelmingly tell you not to annihilate their existences on the spot, lest they wind up in hell later. The people like that who do go to hell might end up being tortured into changing their minds about that, because pain can have the power to change people's minds by force, or just because they're the ones who got unlucky. That doesn't mean their original self, who accepted that probability in exchange for their chance of ending up happy ever after in Axis or Elysium, was making the wrong decision based on a bad model of hell and learned something in hell that changed their mind. It's just like somebody who took a great gamble with a high expected value, happened to lose that gamble, and is now unhappy. You are wrong, Keltham, to think that most of the people in hell made no choices worth mentioning, in going there, that change how much it matters that they're in pain. You think that because you believe deep in your heart that everybody in Golarion is a child who can't make meaningful choices. In this you are wrong. They're just a different kind of adult who is not shaped the peculiar way that Dathilani are trained to recognize as adults, which is only one particular kind of adulthood that obtains in Dathilan. If you'd been allowed to leave, or been safe to leave, your tiny enclosures in Cheliax, in Osirion, in this new lair, and take in the wide range of cultures across Golarion that has so much more variation than Dath Ilan, you might realize you are surrounded by 100 different kinds of adults, not a world full of nothing but children. A great many of them have handled more adversity and more serious situations in their lives than Dath Ilani adults ever do. This also affects how much you should listen to them when they ask you to please not kill them, their families and ancestors in their afterlives, and destroy all of their children and all of the children they'll ever have. Even if you're right about people just ending up somewhere else, they will end up someplace worse than Golarion if they're scattered into a wider multiverse. It's known about Pharasma's creation that the things outside of it are no friends to anything inside, and that's just about all we know about them. Pharasma did everybody here a service in creating them someplace as friendly as this place is. Scattering them outside of it is, maybe, a worse disservice to children than maledicting them to hell. You don't know what lies beyond Golarion. Maybe it's better. You don't know what lies in this universe's future. Maybe it's better. You'd be destroying that too. Anytime you make up a plan which has a step that includes release Rovagug, anybody native to Golarion would immediately and correctly recognize that you have made a reasoning error somewhere along the way, just like everybody else who concludes that. It is a heuristic that is simple, valid, and correct about your particular case. There has to be a better way. Iomedae hasn't given up on this universe. Why should you? Iomedae lives here and knows the place better, and has worked on it for longer, and is much, much smarter and better informed than you are. She doesn't seem to think it's hopeless. You're not going to beat Pharasma. She's larger than you are. Even Iomedae isn't trying that. You haven't looked for a better way, or have not looked nearly hard enough, because this world hurt you a lot, and you want it gone. Or maybe you just find it painful to look at it in enough detail to decide whether or not it should be gone. Somebody in as much pain as you, as broken as you, is the wrong person to say, I know better than everybody here asking me not to do this. This world should end. And then types and retypes more briefly, because wow, is this taking some time. My beliefs about the probable loci of my disagreements with Carissa Sevar, more located and pointed at than argued. A possibly theoretically unresolvable epistemic disagreement, though we'll know better at INT 29, where I've updated off my isekai experience about what typically happens, and ended up in a world full of people to whom this observation is theoretically inaccessible. Very different model of the theoretical origins, and hence likely psychology of beings and powers who could devise continuation causal weaves for otherwise halted entities. In particular, greater expectation of coordination among them, and expecting most utility functions of non-mortal carrying such entities to settle on maxima which don't have mortals inside them at all. Unresolvable values, difference about disutility of non-existence, eternal suffering, null, eternal happiness, would consider hell at least 100 times as bad as Axis is good. Do not in fact respect reasoning of local mortals about their afterlife prospects. Suspect they're mostly not thinking about it. Non-existence isn't exactly an easy option for them anyways. don't think their expressed opinions are really bound to the relative weight of an eternity in Axis or Hell. Know people who can remember millennia of existence as paving stone, Lemure, and also millennia in Axis, and do an interpersonal comparison there, if even that would be meaningful, and not just default to whichever came last. Given all that, situation with 9x Axis inhabitants saying this life was a good deal, and 1x Hell inhabitants saying bad deal, doesn't seem so much like a 90% majority vote, as people dividing a cake where 9 get nice deals and 1 gets crumbs. The person who got the crumbs has a kind of priority in saying whether the overall deal was fair or not. Pharasma thought the things she trapped in her creation couldn't endanger her, and so she did not need to treat with them as agents and divide gains fairly with them, or even ask what they wanted. I see myself as agent, this world as a deal, and reject the deal. Expect Golarian typical, Pharasma roughly balanced entire multiverse to sort around 1/3 tiers of petitioners to each category on each axis. No obvious reason why Pharasma would have built a setup where later on almost nobody got sorted to hell in her own expectation. Suspect Iomede's goddess of victory over evil deal maybe not so much distorts her probabilities as constrains the way she can behave about them. Iomede has notably not distributed a timetable with probabilities to her followers. Iomede is opposed by gods much more powerful than her, and maybe smarter who do not want her to win. If everybody got hope by trying hard, every god would own that hope to the same degree, none more hopeful than the others. Have estimate of Pharasma's apparent power given observations about her does not seem to rule out rigging her creation to destruct. I'm sort of broken, yeah. Everyone else in Galarian is completely bugshit wacko, though. Tropian probability distortions. Clearly a thing, even allowing for some of our history to have been produced by divine interventions imitating tropes. If we don't do this now, Pharasma's creation might be waiting a long, long time on the next story-empowered people who would have a probabilistically anomalous chance at fixing or even changing things.
In Pharasma's creation, there are many people who don't want to exist and do not have a good way to achieve this. The overwhelming majority of those are in Hell, but probably there are also some in Abaddon and the Abyss, and maybe the Maelstrom and the dungeons of various people on Galarian and planets like Galarian, plus some who are suffering and uncertain enough about their afterlife not to kill themselves despite having access to the option. They often suffer slowly in a way that changes who they are as people and means that even if at some point they stop being conscious, a version of them that landed on another planet at that point would not be very much like the person they were before they suffered so much. This is bad under approximately every conceivable value system. Under the value system most common in Dathilan, where everyone has thought about ethics a lot more and some people are smarter, this is so bad that killing approximately 9 people whose lives are eternal and good in order to prevent one person from suffering in this way is clearly justified. Dath Ilani would practically all agree on this. It is true that people in Galarian mostly don't see it that way when they are not in Hell, but they mostly try to avoid thinking about it and might believe false things about it. Hell lies relentlessly about what sends you there and what it's like. People in Cheliax mostly fear Hell and try not to think about it. People in other places do move mountains to avoid it. Lots of lawful evil people in private will admit that they are scared. The fact they don't atone or don't try to be chaotic is about their suppressing thoughts of how they'll go to Hell in abject terror, not about their actual preference. Even if someone prefers Hell to non-existence, once they've been in Hell for a little while, they'll almost definitely change their mind. Even if someone does things that condemn them to Hell for the sake of protecting their children, so that their children will get to eternity in Axis instead of being eaten in Abaddon, they'll regret that choice and wish they'd chosen differently approximately as soon as Hell actually starts on them. Even if they don't for 100 years, they will in 1,000 years. Even if they don't for 1,000 years, they will in 100,000 years. People on Galarian don't know how to think about those scales. Hell deliberately discourages thinking on those scales, and it's hard to understand how bad Hell is until you are actually being tortured there. It is not a fact you can know any other way. Any viable plan to fix Hell, where nearly all but not all of this suffering is located, probably incurs some risk of killing everyone in the multiverse. The plan that incurs the least risk of that is probably destroying Avernus so that further people cannot go to hell, which would not necessarily be permanent. The plans that are most definitely permanent, like killing Asmodeus and taking his job or trying to force Pharasma to change the rules of her creation, incur a quite high risk of this. Plans to kill Asmodeus and take his job are probably more than 50% likely to result in his releasing Rovagug, which is probably at least 20% likely to destroy the universe and 80% likely to destroy Golarion, which may or may not be important for building civilization within Pharasma's creation. Plans to force Pharasma to change the rules of her creation will, if they fail either by Pharasma laughing at Keltham and crushing him, in which case no improvements to the universe at all will be achieved, or in the entire universe being destroyed, possibly by Yog-Sothoth or something in an existentially horrifying, hell-like, slow personality death way. Failure modes like that are very unlikely. If they succeed, they might change not just hell, but also significant features of other planes that have a high rate of petitioners there being very unhappy or being eaten. Pharasma does not particularly share human values, and a universe run on rules set by Keltham would be much nicer for humans and similar kinds of mortals to live in, or not exist at all if making a universe that's substantially nicer to live in is not possible within these constraints. When Keltham experienced dying, he experienced showing up in Golarion. All people, when their soul is permanently deleted from existence, should anticipate having the experience of waking up somewhere else like he did. In the typical case, this will not be worse than the lives that those people are currently living in Golarion. In particular, the percentage of people who will turn out to have moment-of-death copies that are slaves who cannot suicide, or in hell dimensions, or in incomprehensible conditions that alter their cognition as they kill them, is very low. The fact this is true means that being killed is much less bad than it would be if there were not copies of you in other places, some of whom will remember the moment of your death. The fact this is true also means it is better to kill someone instantaneously than for them to die in a slow way that alters their personality and values, because if they die instantaneously, then they'll experience continuity with a copy of them elsewhere, which hasn't already changed in a way that changes their identity as a person. It is undesirable that people will never see their families again, be separated from their children and husbands and wives, lose everything they have and were working towards, etc. But the undesirability of this is much, much, much smaller than the undesirability of hell. It is probably not the case that most people would readily risk hell to be present for their children's infancy and childhood, and if they say they would, it is probably because they are underestimating the badness of hell. Also, under the present system, many people are separated from their loved ones permanently anyway, and an ideal fix to Pharasma's creation would improve the world along this metric. It is not bad that people will exist about 1 billion times less, because it doesn't subjectively feel like anything to exist, and is not part of most human value systems in Dath Ilan. Those people who think it is part of their value systems would almost always reconsider if they could discuss the matter with a keeper. The gods as they are currently situated seem likely to stop any planet in Pharasma's creation from building civilization, or at least likely to stop it from spreading its discoveries to the rest of Pharasma's creation. It seems reasonably likely that they're only presently allowing the scientific revolution because they don't see where it's headed. In the absence of intervention to change the rules and ensure civilization is allowed to come about, it seems possible the inhabited planets within creation will either persist for a very long time, not being much better as a place to live, or else get destroyed the first time they get far enough out of equilibrium. Some gods want them gone, or else get destroyed by Dath Ilan or some force like it that is trying to maximize average happiness of instantiated minds across the multiverse. If that is a common value, which it probably is because everyone in Dath Ilan is very smart and it was approximately universal there, and if Pharasma's creation is as vulnerable to destruction as it looks, then Pharasma's creation is going to get destroyed sooner or later, unless someone brings average quality of life there above a reasonable estimate of how bad the greater multiverse is. Pharasma is fundamentally the kind of entity who has no business running a multiverse, and so it is good, other things equal, to make her stop that. And it is worth at least some small probability of the multiverse being destroyed to wrest control of it from an alien entity that does not share human values, unless greater reality is even worse. If the policy destroy bits of greater reality that you are not glad you landed in is followed by all people waking up in unfamiliar universes, then maybe in the long run everyone who wakes up in an unfamiliar universe will wake up in a pretty good one. So the repeat application of this process makes it more and more of a good idea over time. The fact Dathilani were taught to think about the world this way, including game theory about cleaning up bits of greater reality you find yourself in where Zon Cathan asks for 10 GP, suggests that Dathilan may already have calculated this is a good idea. Guesses about where Keltham and I most disagree. I expect that it's easier to destroy yourself in Pharasma's creation than in most places. Everyone has a physical body, and if you destroy it, you go somewhere else. If you destroy it as an outsider, that's it. Most possible ways to have a mind exist don't involve that mind having fairly straightforward things it can do to cease its function and ensure its function doesn't have to start again. It is widely known even among peasants in random places that if you're neutral evil, you go to Abaddon and get eaten, and most people actively avoid this. But if a person had an unusually strong non-existence preference, they cannot exist. I don't believe this is true of most possible souls or minds. I think that it is possible for good lives to be as good as bad lives in hell are bad, even for normal people who don't care about existing as much as me. I don't know exactly what extremely good lives are, and I don't know what share of people in good afterlives I'd say have them, but it feels to me like things can be as good as they are bad. Certainly my most good experiences are as strongly preferable above baseline as my most bad experiences are negative, and I have had some experiences that are fairly hell-like. I'm willing to get tortured harder if a failure of imagination about what hell is like might be relevant. We disagree about how much the revealed preferences of Golarianites are relevant. I don't think that people not trying to avoid hell means they don't mind hell. It's often that they're very muddled. I do think that when people decide that they are willing to do evil things and go to hell in order to, say, make a lot of money to raise their dead baby and give that baby a good life in Axis, they frequently understand exactly the trade they are making and are within their rights to make it, and it is a terrible wrong to them to destroy the children they worked to save in order to save them from suffering in hell. I do think it's suggestive that everyone was appalled about the demons eating souls out of the river of souls and eating babies in the boneyard. I also think it's suggestive that many people, if you ask them, would take on considerable risk of hell to protect their loved ones from Abaddon. I think that the fact that people mostly go to hell for doing awful things to other people matters in our evaluation of whether they got an unfair division of gains or not. It makes it feel, to me, more like they played a lottery and want the winners killed, so they don't have the consequences of losing than like they were randomly assigned an unfair share. You have to be a bad person to go to hell. You have to knowingly treat people very badly on purpose. I think that civilization can find better ways to fix creation and fix hell in the next 100 years, once there are headbands everywhere and not much scarcity. Not everyone in creation is human or even humanoid. The overwhelming share of them are not. I think that Keltham has not thought enough about whether he is doing right by very, very inhuman minds, some of which might have very different preferences from humans, like being much more okay with hell, or for that matter being much more harmed by Axis or Nirvana, or by waking up in another universe, say because they're a telepathic hive mind that dies slowly in horrible suffering if separated from their kin. Keltham is weird enough that it seems plausible to me that for most creatures in Pharasma's creation, moving it towards Keltham's values will leave them worse off. Relatedly, I think it's hard to evaluate how reasonably Pharasma is running creation with a view of just one planet, but her running of it seems basically reasonable to me, except for how the wrong person is in charge of hell. I think it's reasonably likely that Pharasma will just crush Keltham, and then everything will be much worse with a huge opportunity for making them better totally lost and gone. I think that if we start by letting out Rovagug, then the net effect of Keltham will be empowering Asmodeus, getting the one planet without prophecy eaten and foregoing a chance to fix almost everything. I also think it's pretty likely that we'll all just get slowly and horrifyingly eaten by Yog-Sothoth or something if Pharasma stops protecting the universe. An implication of the above is that I think if you try this, we should mostly expect to wake up in worlds where you tried this and it failed in some way. That is where most minds that have continuity from our current existence is. I don't think that killing someone across billions of worlds is made meaningfully less bad by there existing a copy of them somewhere at some point. I think that Keltham is deeply unusual in many respects, which could be relevant to whether you wake up somewhere else when you die, and we should not necessarily conclude that everyone who dies will experience waking up somewhere else. I don't think I care very much about the specific path by which a mind dies, even if I grant that they'll wake up somewhere else. A copy of me that is me from a year ago is about as good as a copy from right this minute, when I haven't just been through a very transformative year. So, to whatever extent a copy makes it less bad that I was murdered, an out-of-date copy is almost as good as a new one. I think Keltham cares a lot about this. I think that hell is not worse than non-existence, at least for me, and plausibly for most people, but I don't even know that it's worth arguing this one.
All right, you've read mine. I've had a chance to read yours. Meta-level comments, things I failed to make clear about how the process supposedly worked that are more obvious now that you've seen literally one example of it. In retrospect, we should have run a pilot where we first tried this on. Some other disagreement we had in the past where your position was mostly real, you'd know better what the choices were than I.
I think from my perspective, this was about the result I expected. I am sure I didn't do it in the proper Dathalani way, but it looks like my attempt was in fact probably close enough to work from.
Yeah, I'm trying to remind myself that it would not be remotely fair to judge this the way that a Dathalani audience would be judging it right now. Like I did not, for example, actually say out loud that your description of my views was to be written from Keltham's perspective, as if by Keltham. I don't think your presentation of my views really emphasized the parts I'd emphasize, and there's strange little hiccups in your model of my model of Dathilan. We could now take each other's write-ups and underline parts we noticeably disagreed with in the other's presentation of what was supposed to be our own view. First, I'm curious how you'd rate my attempt to write from your perspective overall.
It seemed like you were thinking of existence is much better than non-existence as a big part of my argument against destroying the universe, and it's a big part of my personal priorities, and I did, in fact, prefer when it came up with Abigail to be tortured for arbitrary lengths of time if I was going to cease existing at the end of it, because suffering was so much better than not existing. But I think that actually fairly little of my argument rests on that. That'd be relevant if we were debating destroying a universe where everyone went to hell. Scattering them outside of it is maybe a worse disservice to children than maledicting them to hell. Is wrong about my views, it seems pretty unlikely to me that most of the greater reality is worse for humans than hell. Just that even if 1% of it is as bad as hell, that's probably trillions of children you're sending to hell, and that most of it is worse than the balance of the outer planes. I don't think you should learn from the fact everyone thinks releasing Rovagug is a bad plan. I feel like the reasons it's a bad plan are pretty self-evident, and there's not additional information in public opinion. I think you're condescending to Galarian people, but that's mostly just relevant to the degree of consultation you'll get on your plan. I don't really think it's actually the driver of your plan or worth talking you out of. I figured I'd just consult everyone myself and then translate for you. Your write-up does not emphasize much how, with the resources we'll have 1 week from now, we can probably at least fix Avernus in a much safer way, and the civilization we can build will contain people much, much smarter than us, who might think of a much, much smarter solution to hell, and who will have the option of this solution, so long as we don't blow up the only planet where prophecy is broken. You don't really mention downside risks of, say, getting the one planet without prophecy eaten so no one can ever rise up against the gods again, or getting us all taken by whatever got Zon Kuthon. I think those feature pretty significantly in my thinking about this. Iomade might be wrong about whether the universe before you arrived was going to end well for good, but there's a truly transformative number and kind of resources now available. Hell has been betting on the products of this interworld contact as if they're a really, really big deal, as if they are a loophole in the God agreements about information sharing. I think that we can take Avernus and build civilization and leave the rest to our intellectual heirs, a generation down the line, who will be equipped for this problem in a way we aren't. And I think that's really the core of my reasoning here, that we don't have to choose this plan or nothing, that there is so much potential to do something else which is not this.
Sounds like mostly gaps of omission then, or mistakes of emphasis if you want to put it that way. Give me a second and I'll pass back the underlined version of yours with some notes. Shouldn't take much time and seems easier than saying. In Pharasma's creation, there are many people who don't want to exist and do not have a good way to achieve this. The overwhelming majority of those are in hell, but probably there are also some in Abaddon and the Abyss, and maybe the Maelstrom and the dungeons of various people on Galarion and planets like Galarion, plus some who are suffering and uncertain enough about their afterlife not to kill themselves despite having access to the option. They often suffer slowly in a way that changes who they are as people, and means that even if at some point they stop being conscious, a version of them that landed on another planet at that point would not be very much like the person they were before they suffered so much. Yep, this is the core problem. Pharasma's unfair deal would not be a destroy the multiverse issue if not for this. This is bad under approximately every conceivable value system. Under the value system most common in Dath Ilan, where everyone has thought about ethics a lot more, and some people are smarter, this is so bad that killing approximately 9 people whose lives are eternal and good, in order to prevent one person from suffering in this way, is clearly justified. Dath Ilani would practically all agree on this. This is a values difference, not something where it matters what another place thinks. It is true that people in Galarion mostly don't see it that way when they are not in hell, but they mostly try to avoid thinking about it, and might believe false things about it. Hell lies relentlessly about what sends you there, and what it's like. People in Cheliax mostly fear hell and try not to think about it. People in other places do move mountains to avoid it. Lots of lawful evil people, in private, will admit that they are scared. The fact they don't atone or don't try to be chaotic is about their suppressing thoughts of how they'll go to hell in abject terror, not about their actual preference. Even if someone prefers hell to non-existence, once they've been in hell for a little while, they'll almost definitely change their mind. Even if someone does things that condemn them to hell for the sake of protecting their children, so that their children will get to eternity in Axis instead of being eaten in Abaddon, they'll regret that choice and wish they'd chosen differently approximately as soon as hell actually starts on them. Even if they don't for 100 years, they will in 1,000 years. Even if they don't for 1,000 years, they will in 100,000 years. People on Galarion don't know how to think about those scales. Hell deliberately discourages thinking on those scales, and it's hard to understand how bad hell is until you are actually being tortured there. It is not a fact you can know any other way. Being tortured in hell still doesn't let you do the interpersonal utility comparison we actually need. Being tortured into regret of saving your children doesn't make it the wrong decision. Still an awful one, though. Any viable plan to fix hell, where nearly all but not all of this suffering is located, probably incurs some risk of killing everyone in the multiverse. The plan that incurs the least risk of that is probably destroying Avernus so that further people cannot go to hell, which would not necessarily be permanent. The plans that are most definitely permanent, like killing Asmodeus and taking his job, or trying to force Pharasma to change the rules of her creation, incur a quite high risk of this. Plans to kill Asmodeus and take his job are probably more than 50% likely to result in his releasing Rovagug, which is probably at least 20% likely to destroy the universe and 80% likely to destroy Golarion, which may or may not be important for building civilization within Pharasma's creation. I'd maybe say more like 30% of destroying Golarion. Currently put low estimate on Golarion's importance if we can't otherwise beat Pharasma gods. Plans to force Pharasma to change the rules of her creation will, if they fail either by Pharasma laughing at Keltham and crushing him, in which case no improvements to the universe at all will be achieved, or in the entire universe being destroyed, possibly by Yog-Sothoth, or something in an existentially horrifying hell-like, slow personality death way. Failure modes like that are very unlikely. If they succeed, they might change not just hell, but also significant features of other planes that have a high rate of petitioners, there being very unhappy or being eaten. Pharasma Crush wouldn't seem that unlikely, if not for tropes. Obvious ways to rig multiverse for destruction don't seem to me to run much Yog-Sothoth risk. Pharasma does not particularly share human values, and a universe run on rules set by Keltham would be much nicer for humans and similar kinds of mortals to live in, or not exist at all, if making a universe that's substantially nicer to live in is not possible within these constraints. Didn't think I could set rules, but get them modified, sure. When Keltham experienced dying, he experienced showing up in Golarion. All people, when their soul is permanently deleted from existence, should anticipate having the experience of waking up somewhere else like he did. In the typical case, this will not be worse than the lives that those people are currently living in Golarion. In particular, the percentage of people who will turn out to have moment-of-death copies that are slaves who cannot suicide, or in hell dimensions, or in incomprehensible conditions that alter their cognition as they kill them, is very low. The fact this is true means that being killed is much less bad than it would be if there were not copies of you in other places, some of whom will remember the moment of your death. The fact this is true also means it is better to kill someone instantaneously than for them to die in a slow way that alters their personality and values, because if they die instantaneously, then they'll experience continuity with a copy of them elsewhere, which hasn't already changed in a way that changes their identity as a person. My case doesn't need to be typical, just in some sense normal or not in a distinguished region of low probability. It is undesirable that people will never see their families again, be separated from their children and husbands and wives, lose everything they have and were working towards, etc. But the undesirability of this is much, much, much smaller than the undesirability of hell. It is probably not the case that most people would readily risk hell to be present for their children's infancy and childhood, and if they say they would, it is probably because they are underestimating the badness of hell. Also, under the present system, many people are separated from their loved ones permanently anyway, and an ideal fix to Pharasma's creation would improve the world along this metric. Not how system necessarily works. Nice destinations can synchronize arrival of related people. It is not bad that people will exist about 1 billion times less, because it doesn't subjectively feel like anything to exist, and is not part of most human value systems in Dath Ilan. Those people who think it is part of their value systems would almost always reconsider if they could discuss the matter with a keeper. Depends on if the less existing were above or below greater reality average. Obviously, I currently guess Pharasma's creation is below average. Keepers would disagree, kinda not how people in civilization think. They'll add because it's invalid, and then eliminate the keeper part. The gods as they are currently situated seem likely to stop any planet in Pharasma's creation from building civilization, or at least likely to stop it from spreading its discoveries to the rest of Pharasma's creation. It seems reasonably likely that they're only presently allowing the scientific revolution because they don't see where it's headed. In the absence of intervention to change the rules and ensure civilization is allowed to come about, it seems possible the inhabited planets within creation will either persist for a very long time, not being much better as a place to live, or else get destroyed the first time they get far enough out of equilibrium. Some gods want them gone, or else get destroyed by Dath Ilan, or some force like it, that is trying to maximize average happiness of instantiated minds across the multiverse. If that is a common value, which it probably is because everyone in Dath Ilan is very smart, and it was approximately universal there, and if Pharasma's creation is as vulnerable to destruction as it looks, then Pharasma's creation is going to get destroyed sooner or later unless someone brings average quality of life there above a reasonable estimate of how bad the greater multiverse is. I'm not expecting Dath Ilan's utility function to be common among things more powerful than Pharasma that connect to Pharasma's creation. Pharasma is fundamentally the kind of entity who has no business running a multiverse, and so it is good, other things equal, to make her stop that, and it is worth at least some small probability of the multiverse being destroyed to wrest control of it from an alien entity that does not share human values, unless greater reality is even worse. Yep. If the policy destroy bits of greater reality that you are not glad you landed is followed by all people waking up in unfamiliar universes, then maybe in the long run, everyone who wakes up in an unfamiliar universe will wake up in a pretty good one. So the repeat application of this process makes it more and more of a good idea over time. The fact Dathilani were taught to think about the world this way, including game theory about cleaning up bits of greater reality you find yourself in, where Zon Kuthon asks for $10, suggests that Dath Ilan may already have calculated this is a good idea. Pretty sure they weren't teaching me things I'd need to know for Golarion. This is mostly just a special case of rejecting bad deals, Inkle Pharasma's non-deal.
She reads through it, nods, sighs. Well, one of the things that I was thinking might convince me to work with you was if you thought an unfixed creation was vulnerable to other universe destroyers. But I appreciate you telling me you don't think that, and think creation would probably be otherwise safe.
It would be a common courtesy in civilization while prosecuting a disagreement, and one I hope I can expect symmetrically from you. Yeah, we're doing trusting negotiations here, I hope.
Yes, I think I have some kind of additional disagreement with you now about if every human in Dath Ilan ends up with the same views on something as apparently subjective as average utilitarianism, then I don't think it feels right to just assert that's all their unchangeable utility functions. People don't have utility functions. People are muddled, and Dath Ilani society reliably resolves that muddle in that way. But I am not sure that's different than how Cheliax reliably resolves various muddles in various ways. I'd feel more confident it was a utility function thing if it was, say, 85% of people in Dath Ilan. I realize some utility function things should in fact be overwhelmingly common among humans, but this really, really doesn't seem like one of them, especially given all the absurd-seeming claims it makes. You're going to say we should discuss this at INT 29, but it seems like it would imply you should destroy perfectly good universes under a wide variety of circumstances, including if that subjectively sends everyone in them to hell, so long as most of greater reality is much nicer than those perfectly good universes. And maybe some people believe that, but I am suspicious of claims that it ends up in nearly all human utility functions, unless you deliberately engineer your whole society to make them think that.
I wasn't saying that average utilitarianism was just a matter of utility functions. The averaging part is something that's pinned down by some pseudo-law fragmentish arguments relative to the human pre-utility function muddle that shakes out into a utility function. One way of looking at it is that it doesn't make any more sense to ask, what if there was twice as much sentience in reality, any more than it makes sense to ask, what if everything in reality was twice as large, or what if time everywhere was running half as fast? Not sure we should dive on that right now. I don't think average utilitarianism per se is liable to be a crux of disagreement. Though if we both converted to total utilitarianism, we'd then be faced with a question of whether Pharasma's creation is above or below zero, which seems entirely utility functional, rather than the question of whether creation is above or below average.
That does sound like it might be more productive if we wait.
I unfortunately get a sense from having taken the disagreement this far that the real crux is liable to be the sense to which I've lived in a universe which wasn't tropey in the slightest, where everything just bubbled up from directly visible math in a directly visible way, and by comparison Golarion looks really blatantly tropey to me, even if it's ultimately a real thing that got selected really sharply for tropiness. So I'm also expecting to a much higher degree that the universe has been set on track for a bad end, unless the protagonists do something. Your worldview has a much higher prior that we might not need to do something that looks like the climax of a story for things to end up pretty much all right 100 years later, because we're not that special, and our efforts don't need to be that desperate. My prior is more that I've been put into a situation where, if I try to, the trope would be, refuse the call. The multiverse is otherwise set to have the ancient gods crush out civilization. Our enemies get their own diamond synthesis not that far behind us. Asmodeus is not dumber than Iomide, and has his own symmetrical plans about how to eliminate heaven as opposition. There was an apparent plotline about just building civilization. That plotline got trashed with the reveal of the conspiracy. If we want to pursue that question on the object level, instead of direct meta level, we could talk plans to take over just Avernus.
I thought you thought on tropes logic I was the protagonist. In which case, it's true that the universe is set for a bad end unless I do something, my ex is going to destroy it. I haven't had much time to think about plans to take over Avernus. If you've thought about it a ton and have nothing, and Carmen doesn't think there's anything the Church of Iomade could do even with 1,000,000 wishes, I'll be more pessimistic there.
Fair enough. You didn't show up being the protagonist until a day ago, and I'll have to rethink what possible storylines remain consistent given that. I have not thought very much about plans to take over Avernus in particular. I suppose if this universe is to last long enough that the number of people already in hell would end up being dominated by new people, I am not sure I actually have it in me to abandon the souls currently in hell. Fair warning, anything that comes to that conclusion might end up being something where I look over the logic and do the calculation and then throw the calculation away and instead not abandon the souls currently in hell. I suppose, if I were the big problem that this universe faces, that would make me not too easily solvable from your standpoint. Carmen is not, I think, somebody with the spark herself to envision plans on that scale. Most people in Golarion don't have that, Carissa. It's not just Cheliax that burns it out of people.
It seems good that most people aren't like that. They'd be destroying the world left and right. The other part, that's one of the things on my list to persuade you of. That even if the world is bad enough to risk destroying it to fix it, the set of changes that'd make that no longer true are pretty small. There are trillions of people leading good lives. There's lots of potential to fix things through non-world-destroying mechanisms. If we succeeded at taking Avernus, no one would ever go to hell in its present form again. You'd have saved the people who were begging to die. You'd have saved every person who'll ever be born. At that point, to kill everyone, to send many of them to something as bad as hell, to risk feeding everything to Yog-Sothoth, to risk getting crushed and achieving nothing at all, including the Avernus fix, because the first pass at fixing things didn't solve literally every instance of suffering in the multiverse. I can't actually make any sense of that. Relatedly, we don't need to ask Pharasma for a contraceptive cleric spell. We can just make and distribute Ilani contraception, or build it into rings of sustenance, which we give the whole population for free. We don't need to ask Pharasma for landing spaces in the Maelstrom or the Abyss. A civilization with the resources we should be able to command in a few decades can just build those. The only things that you actually need to ask Pharasma, in the sense they can only be done with her leave, are removing Asmodeus and getting rid of malediction and preserving somewhere where civilization can grow without being crushed, and I don't think it's defensible to ask for anything else. Anything else you ask for is trading off us getting it slightly sooner for in expectation killing tens of billions of people, and virtually none of the people in creation would take that trade. It's one thing to imagine telling them all that the reason they are now to be annihilated is to stop hell. I think it's wrong, but I see in a way. It is another thing entirely to imagine telling them the reason they are now to be annihilated is that we wanted birth control to be a cleric spell instead of a non-magical invention to be widely distributed starting in a decade or so.
I think a major problem I have with this scenario is how many things need to go sort of right, sort of the way you hoped, over an extended period, while facing a lot of adversaries who are aware of you and making their own plans and who don't want your hopes to go that way. Without the methods of diamond manufacture leaking to Cheliax or being rediscovered by them, without Golarion being destroyed by opposed wishes, without all of the diamonds we make suddenly vanishing, without it suddenly becoming impossible to manufacture diamonds, without the laws of magic shifting so that diamonds are no longer useful in resurrections and wishes, without all of the neutral and evil gods banding together to prevent the good gods from growing too powerful. There's also things that have to go right for me to successfully destroy the multiverse in a surprise attack, but they're fewer and less adversarially opposed. They just consist of particular things that need to already be true, rather than our adversaries staying in place, not making plans while only we get to make plans. I am hoping to take Pharasma by surprise, once. Afterwards, either this multiverse is gone, which is acceptable to me, or I've negotiated with her, once, to put this multiverse into a state where it's possible for the forces of good to clean it up with a lot of hard work. This universe contains a lot of powerful things besides Iomide. I believe in a plan where we take them by surprise, using temporary unknown advantages like diamond synthesis and my grasp of how to destroy multiverses. I don't believe in a plan where the good gods beat all other gods over an extended period because of a discovery that didn't remain unknown once it was used. I don't believe that we get to make plans and they don't get to make plans once the advantage of surprise is lost. I don't believe we get to shove this world out of its current equilibrium to a new place, in spite of all the restoring forces that kept it in this state to begin with, unless we can beat those forces, and those forces are Pharasma and the ancient gods. I don't believe we get to make plans and have those plans be real, once other agents are making plans too.
All right, so one important area of disagreement is what the set of minimal concessions from Pharasma that makes it likely civilization can fix things from there is. And related to that, I should probably be trying to figure out if Abadar is willing to commit to defending civilization and making sure it gets to exist. If Sarenrae is... I don't know who else might be relevant.
Abadar will appreciate civilization if it exists, I think. Having him defend it from other gods is a whole different story, especially when it doesn't already exist, and Abadar is very confused about a lot of the things that make up a stable civilization from a mortal standpoint. Sarenrae. I have concerns about the thing where she smote a city, and I am not very reassured by the part where she's supposed to have realized afterwards that this was a bad idea. It sounds more like mortals trying to paper over divine unpleasantness than how I imagine ancient gods working. It's not clear to me that Dathilan's civilization wouldn't... not actually arrest Sarenrae. She's done some good work for mortals, but tell her that she needed to clean up her act a bit. My model isn't that there's nobody out there for civilization to cut a deal with. I think they're not powerful enough, and that the ancient gods opposed to them will squash civilization before civilization gets powerful enough to participate in ancient god deals.
If Abadar would want civilization, but is confused about what it will look like and how to bring it about, and we would benefit from him defending it from other gods, then that seems like among the most solvable problems we've run across yet. Abadar also might know more than us about how powerful anti-civilization forces are, and whether Pharasma's one of them, or whether she'd be willing to defend civilization given certain assurances.
I could be wrong, but my current strong guess is that when it comes to tech and magitech on the level of spell silver refining, Axis already knows how to do it. Aslant knew how to do it. Abadar's first vault still has all of Aslant's books. My being here did not make advanced spell silver refining be possible for the first time, because the knowledge existed for the first time. It made it be a default outcome rather than an outcome that required any gods to intervene. If the gods wanted things to be like that collectively, they could have done it much earlier. That's part of why I strongly expect the scientific revolution to otherwise get shut down before it proceeds too far, and why I expect that the ancient gods favoring it would not have a supermajority as more and more other ancient gods' interests are threatened. Urgathoa, Gorum. It maybe goes differently if Project Lawful remains on par with the scientific revolution and Cheliax conquers half of Golarion and remains in a constant state of battle with the scientific revolution, such that Gorum and Asmodeus favor the new state of affairs. But now we are once again getting into the space of possible outcomes where I am no longer very happy about it and want to fall back on the Nope plan. It is possible that nobody around except Pharasma and Ottomans are allowed to know how to rig up planes for destruction. You plausibly need to run particular high-energy experiments to figure out some of those even at INT-40, and if Pharasma can prohibit those experiments, she can prohibit anybody from figuring out how to make a plane erase itself.
That all sounds right, but the closer civilization is to something the ancient gods are all right with, the smaller the concession needed, which means we can ask for less from Pharasma and have better odds of getting it, or find another way to get it. And I think it's worth my seeing your concrete projections about, if the problem is specifically Gorum and the evil gods, that's a different state of affairs than if the problem is all of the ancient gods. Or all of them but Abadar.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059.